Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 16th edition of the Global Meeting of the Women's Forum, the first ever fully virtual edition. My name is Sophie Lambin, and I'm the editorial partner for the forum. It has been a real honor to have worked with our many partners and allies to create this year's program. It is a program with a clear purpose. First, we look to understand and address the issues which are most pressing in our societies and economies, with a particular concern for how women are most affected by these challenges. Second, we look to create the conditions for women leaders to thrive. We want to unlock their power to lead and to be a force for good. The pandemic has put the spotlight on long-held assumptions about how we live and work. It has highlighted the gaps and inequalities that persist. It calls on us to change. But we did not need the pandemic to know that we are at a critical point. We were already grappling with the challenges of inclusion and of the climate crisis. COVID-19 has reinforced the fact that we cannot tackle these challenges with one arm tied behind our back. We need the resources, innovative thinking, and creativity of everyone, men and women, across the spectrum of geographies, identities, races, and professions. As we regroup, can we take on the challenges of climate, technology, health, and economic inclusion in new ways? What can we learn from this experience? What successes and momentum do we need to build on? How can we reimagine a better future and create a post-pandemic recovery that is both green and inclusive? The answers to these questions lead to action. This action is based on the work of the Women's Forum and its partners throughout the year to create real change in policy and in business practices. But today, we also want to celebrate the fact that we are here together. Yes, we are physically distanced, but we have stayed connected throughout the crisis and in more than one way. Over the next 3 days, we will make the most of these connections in a virtual world on the Women's Forum platform. We want to collect your expertise, energy, and ideas to be a voice of influence. And to that end, I invite you to share a session with the hashtags WFGM20 and Women for Inclusion. And we likewise ask you to pose your question in the chat during each session. Finally, we are asking you to send us your own story of inclusion. A 1-minute video with a personal anecdote about a time you gave, observed, or received empathy, solidarity, or inclusiveness. Send it to daringcircles@womensforum.com. We will choose several of these to share with the group during the sessions tomorrow and the day after. And now, to reinforce our mandate, it is my great honor to hand over to António Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, with a special message for our speakers and participants.
I send my warmest wishes to this first virtual Women's Forum meeting on shaping an inclusive response and recovery to the COVID-19 pandemic. From job losses to rising rates of domestic violence and the sharp increase in unpaid care work, the impact of COVID-19 has been devastating for women's rights and gender equality. Women are leading the response, keeping families, communities, and economies running. Women leaders are winning praise for their decisiveness, competence, and compassion. But women occupy just a fraction of decision-making and leadership roles in healthcare, government, and businesses. To build a more equal, inclusive, and sustainable world, we need more women in leadership roles in all sectors. We need stronger measures to make sure women are included wherever decisions are made. We need women's full contributions to make a strong recovery from this pandemic and build a better future for all. I wish you the very best for successful and fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Secretary General for those words of inspiration. To enrich this message, let's now dig deeper into the challenges around gender equality. I will now hand over to Henri Vallard, Chairman of Ipsos France and Deputy CEO of the Ipsos Group. He will share some of the unique research from the Women's Forum first Gender Equity Barometer to provide context to our discussions. Henri, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to present to you today the findings of the barometer we conducted for the Women's Forum. The findings are truly very interesting, especially in times of COVID, as you will see. So we conducted this program by interviewing 3,500 people across 7 countries of the G7, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, and United States. A representative sample, as very usual in our business, the quota method, which is a way to have an adjusted population and survey, matching together, and which we conducted online. And of course, in the time of pandemics, it's a very favored method of interviewing people. The important information on this is that it was conducted in the month of August, between the 17th and 31st of August 2020, which is, of course, a time where the epidemic had developed into a pandemic across the world. So a very interesting time to measure a certain number of things. And the findings are really very impactful, I believe, because they reveal numerous reasons to take action and to take action urgently. It truly is, by and large, a call to action. Why? Because the underlying inequalities and perceptions do remain. Because there is an aggravating factor related to the negative impact of the COVID and the fact that this impact is more severe for women than for men. However, there are some reasons to hope and have a positive side. Is we found that people in the G7 we surveyed are aware of the problem behind these inequalities and these obstacles. And even more importantly, because they realize and they expect that taking action would lead to improvements in several fields. I will illustrate now 5 main reasons why to act urgently. So the first one, what we call the inequalities model, the underlying inequalities drivers do remain at play. They remain at play along education, where surprisingly high number of women still say they were told they were not scientifically minded, which is even higher than for men, 23%. So it's not the majority, of course, but it's still surprisingly high in the G7 population we surveyed. But also during the professional life, 46% of women will report that they have the fear not to have enough time to be able to cope with the new professional responsibilities on top of all the rest, which is, again, way higher than for the men with 32%. And also the consequences for the health, as you can see on this slide, very high, 79% of them report being tired and stressed by everything they have to do. And this is, again, more than what the men do feel. So the underlying inequalities drivers are still at play, and they are consistently driving at play to the detriment of women. That's the first reason to act urgently. There is a second one, which is due to the current circumstances, the pandemic. The pandemic truly hits women. It has a higher negative impact on women. Whether it's about being afraid of the future, the women feel this way more than the men. Experiencing the burnout, anxiety or depression related to what I just showed on the slide before. It's an amplification of the stress and the burden. So 59% say they have experienced burnout, anxiety and depression. And again, it's higher than for the men. And same with the loss of confidence. 43% in themselves, confidence in themselves more than for the men. There is just one other comment I would make on this, is that there are also some grounds where, fortunately, men and women seem to experience similar ways of stress. For instance, on the purchase power, this is similar, or on the fear to lose job, this is similar. But as we can see, even if it depends on the topics, there are a certain number of very sensitive domains where COVID truly hits women more than men. That's the second reason to act urgently. The third reason is that this amplification by the may cause to go backwards. And because we still have these very widespread gender stereotypes which are at play, and the crisis can be an amplifier and a driver to go backwards. Again, some very surprisingly high numbers, that 70% still believe it's more difficult for a woman than for a man to have a successful career. With no surprise, this is an average between the two populations. It's even higher for women, well, 74% to think like this, where 67 of the men only believe that it's more difficult. The same, you can't have it all. If you want to be a good mother, you have to agree to sacrifice. Another, classical stereotype, 53%. And that's high. And then another surprisingly high number, like the one I showed at the beginning, 38% still believe that men's brains and women's brains are different. It's almost unbelievable that you have such a high number. And there too, 40% of the men would feel like this versus 35% of the women only. So the amplification of the COVID impact on pre-existing stereotype creates a really concerning risk. However, there are a certain number of things we can capitalize on to go in the right direction. First, there is a rather strong, a very strong actually, awareness that the gender inequality do persist. 69% believe that women do not have access to the same salary level. And this is, of course, more pronounced for women than for men, 77 and 61. And again, two-thirds, more than two-thirds, 67% believe that women have less access to roles on board of directors and senior management in large businesses. And again, higher for women, for men in that perception. But there are other fields like this. I just mentioned two of them, but in several metrics we measured, we find the same pattern. So for instance, if it's about access to financing and investment to start your business, 56% of women would think that it's more difficult, against 43% only for the men. So there is awareness of the problem, and that's a positive sign we can consider. And last reason to act urgently is that there is a very positive expectation and shared expectation that through the change in reducing gender inequality, a certain number of dimensions would improve. 91% of the people we surveyed find that reducing inequalities is important, and more than one-third, 34%, see this as an absolute priority. And 3/4 of the people we surveyed believe this is common to several domains, that enabling women to have more access to senior positions in business would really benefit for innovation, for staff well-being, for working conditions, and corporate and social responsibilities. And this is really shared across the board in different metrics. So this is the fifth reason to act urgently. So in a nutshell, the situation is critical because of an amplification of this harm caused by the COVID. But there are underlying risks which need to be tackled around the COVID, but there are also possibility for improvements because of the awareness of these gender gaps and difficulties, and the expectation that fixing them would improve the situation in many fields. So it's really a good reason to engage for an impact now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Henry, and thank you for sharing those insights, many of them in 10 minutes. I know it was a Herculean effort. I think our next panel has its work cut out with that nuanced picture that you have painted. So we'll now take the opportunity to look at the implications for business and policy for global gender equality and how to lay the groundwork for an inclusive recovery. To take us through this discussion, I'll welcome to the virtual stage our moderator, Stephanie Foster, a diplomat, an advocate, a strategist, and a member of the editorial board of the Women's Forum. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. I will start off by saying that obviously we face tremendous challenges in the world today in terms of COVID, in terms of climate, and in terms of the economic crises that we're facing. We know that because of those crises, we need to build back better. We know that these challenges give us also, though, an opportunity to think creatively and outside the box about how we can do that, how we can mitigate both the downsides of these crises, but also think about how we can reimagine a more inclusive future, a future that's more sustainable, and a future that really brings into bear the talents and skills of all the men and women across the globe who really are central to rebuilding, again, a more prosperous and secure world. So this conference, I think, forces us to really take on those issues, and this panel does as well. And so we've just heard a little bit about the backdrop, but I'd like to turn to our panelists to really have a conversation about where we're going next. And so we have three thought leaders and opinion makers to join us, and I will introduce them briefly first, and then start with a question for the three of them to answer. And then to the extent we have time, we'll really dive in even more deeply. So our three panelists are Ann Cairns, who is the global chair of the 30% Club, which is an organization that's really dedicated its efforts across many countries to increase the number of women on boards and in C-suites across the globe. She's also the executive vice chair of Mastercard. Secondly, we have Sandrine Dixson-Declève, co-president of the Club of Rome and founder of WECAN. And thirdly, Anita Dunn, senior advisor to the Biden-Harris presidential campaign and managing director at SKDKnickerbocker. So I welcome the panelists to the floor and want to start with some questions to them. Really first opening questions to the three of you, and I think I'll start, Sandrine, with you and then move to Anita and Ann, which is, obviously we know this and we've heard through the survey and that we just discussed about the key role of women's leadership in every sector and in every level. So from your perspective, I'd love to hear what you think is working to really increase women's leadership and to get women engaged at every level, whether that's government decision-making or decision-making in the private sector, and thinking about how we can really build on that leadership as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And what a loaded question, but such an important one. I would say that what we're seeing is clearly that in some jurisdictions, quotas have worked. The quota push in different countries to have parity in the government and also in board is really starting to make a difference. But I would also say that the underpinning support for the way in which women can really be in management positions and in government positions needs to come also at the same level. So what we're seeing is those countries that put in place decent healthcare, that also put in place decent childcare provisions, that put in place policies that will enable women to thrive as leaders, either in corporate roles or also in policy roles, is really important. We have to have both. I guess coming to the leadership aspect, I think what's really interesting, and I'm getting a lot of backwash in terms of the echo, so I don't know if people can hear me properly. Okay. I have thought about it though, but anyway, I will continue. So what I'm also seeing is that those women that are really taking the decision to work also with their husbands in both continuing in leadership roles, that have also help, husbands or wives, that also have help in terms of parity within their relationships, which also is changing things. And discussions with young women that have been really revealing around the way in which we're seeing a real generational gap of support in terms of relationships is also super important. So we often talk about quotas, but we need to think also about the way in which we support men. So in Sweden, for example, the fact that we have much longer childcare provisions for men and women is also completely shifting the dynamic in terms of allowing for women to have higher management positions and also higher leadership positions in government. And I'll finish with one last thought, which I think is incredibly important. Sophie opened with the importance today, and we heard the statistics around how COVID is affecting women. It's having a very negative impact, but it's also demonstrating the leadership capabilities of women who are much more human in their approach, less ego-focused in terms of both dealing with their staffs and also dealing with their countries as leaders of governments. And I think it's really important that we take into consideration the new leadership model that many women are showing. I mean, the top countries that came out more resilient in the first phase of COVID were all run by women. It was Merkel, it was the head of Finland, Scotland, New Zealand, and Iceland. And I think that says something about the difference in leadership models that we also need to promote and put out there as incredibly important, both in terms of economies, but also in terms of policy and communication to citizens.
Well, that's great, and that's a great start. I'm going to turn next to Anita, and really the same question, Anita. You know, what have you seen that's worked to increase women's leadership? And also, I mean, really building on what Sandrine talked about and Sophie has discussed, I think it's, you know, what impact does that then have on policy? Because it's obviously government policy is critically important in terms of building a foundation for all of us as citizens, but also for business and civil society. So I'd love to hear from you how you've seen women's leadership really be amplified in the work that you've done.
Well, I think that's a lot of questions that you've just asked, Stephanie. And I apologize to everyone for being a little late here. So I think there are a couple points I just want to make. One is, that we all know that having women at the table in leadership positions makes a huge difference. And it's one of the reasons why the president-elect of the United States felt so strongly about having a woman as his on the ticket with him. Felt so strongly about making sure that the last person who is going to talk to him before he makes a major decision is indeed a woman, which is the agreement he has. It's the agreement he had with President Obama when he served as vice president. It's the agreement he has with Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, that she will have the last say. It is also a recognition of the difference in experiences and lived experiences that people have. You know, we have all talked, and I have been for years someone who felt very strongly about, women on boards. And getting one woman on a board means you get more women on boards because they can go recruit other women. And being told that there was no one, there were no women available. The pipeline is so critically important. And I think that having a woman as vice president is the ultimate pipeline for the United States and for leadership in political office. I also think that businesses are recognizing this, though, that in terms of women in critical positions. And I think that the diversity issue increasingly is one, both in terms of gender and in terms of ethnicity and outlook, is one that used to be seen as something people had to do or were forced to do, and now is seen as a great strength. And I think that as we look at the United States, that this is, you know, as the vice president-elect said on the night she accepted that she was elected, she said she is the first, but she will not be the last. And I think we all recognize that after you have a first, that at that point the door has been opened for additional ones. And I think in terms of policy, and in particular policy in the United States, one of the most striking things about this pandemic has been the disproportionate impact it has had on women in the workforce. And it's horrible, right? And all of us, I certainly have, I can say both from the campaign perspective and the broader perspective, there were a lot of women who worked on this campaign, have been working in government, who were also operating as school teachers during the last several months, and see that continuing. Women are the ones who have disproportionately dropped out of the workforce. Women are the ones whose jobs have disproportionately been eliminated. And that speaks to the importance of women's voices in public policy, because seeing it through that prism is something that is critically important, particularly in the United States, given that women are the majority of people in the country and played such a huge role in the economic growth that we had enjoyed. So sorry, Stephanie, but it was a lot of questions you asked me. So.
I know. I feel I've been chastised a bit by both the other two panelists too, but that's fine. It's just to give a little context. But Anne, I think that's a perfect segue for you to really talk about what you've seen that has worked in terms of getting more women in corporate leadership, both at the board and management level. I do just want to say, I think it is really important to note that, and I think both Sandrine and Anita have talked about this, that part of the reason we need more women at the table and at every table is because we do bring a different lived experience as well as the skills and talents that we have. And so I think just really to reinforce that this is about not just bringing a different set of skills or a different set of looking person who has the same skills, but also just a different way of walking through the world. And so I think that's a really important way to think about this. I'd love to have you talk to the audience about what you've seen that's worked to do that same thing in the corporate sector.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. I'm going to speak from two angles. The first angle that I'll talk from is the Mastercard angle, because I'm the executive vice chair there. And we think about our business through a gender lens, where we think, what are we doing for our people? What do we do for our markets? And what do we do for society? Now, I particularly like this framework because it allows you to actually put things like diversity, gender diversity and wider diversity at the actual center of a company's strategy. And it then allows you to do some very, very practical things in this space. For example, in the people space around the world, we have actually rolled out maternity and paternity leave of 4 months full pay for men and women. And the great thing is that over 70% of our men take their leave, which tells you that the culture of the company is right to get that level playing field between men and women. If you think about the markets, 85% of our products and services, 85% of everyday buying decisions are made by women. So we have to design things that are appealing to women, but also many of the businesses that we work with around the world are run by women. There are about 111 million small and medium-sized businesses that are founded and led by women. And so we're actually developing products and services to ensure that those businesses function properly. And we decided we would reach an extra 50 million SMEs and bring them into the financial system. But instead of just allowing that natural 1/3 of women to be reached out to, we said we want 50% of these companies to be women. So we're going after 25 million women-owned and women-led businesses. And then if you think in terms of society, well, there's so much that we're doing in the society side of things. You know, we're working with the Gates Foundation, supporting vaccines and supporting the development of therapeutics in COVID. But our whole ethos is about inclusion and bringing people into the financial system. And so far, we brought in 500 million people into the financial system in the last 5 years, and we're bringing another 500 million in the next 5 years. And many of these people who are excluded are women, because there's a gap there between men and women in the financial system. So I just mentioned this because I think that every company can develop a framework that works for them. This framework actually would probably work for most companies, but what I would say to any company starting down this path or going down this path is think about it in terms of your core strategy and what your business stands for, and then develop a framework which includes the whole diversity and inclusion angle as core to your business. So that's one thing. The second thing I'd say is the 30% Club was founded 10 years ago in Britain at a time that we had less than 10% women on boards. And we actually reached out to chairs and CEOs, mostly men, and said, don't you think it would be a good idea to diversify your board? Data is showing up here saying that diverse companies outperform non-diverse companies. And some of the men came on board and they actually rang their friends who are other guys that were chairs and CEOs of business. And so much so that eventually now, you know, we have an enormous membership across the FTSE 350. That's the biggest companies listed on the London Stock Exchange. And we're at 33% women on boards, just by the members setting aspirational goals. And of course, we didn't stop there. We signed up membership all over the world. We have 1,200 chairs and CEOs signed up to the club, from Australia to Japan to Brazil to Bogota now. And the thing is that these people are setting aspirational goals for their company, not just to have more women on boards, to have more women in their C-suite. And 30%, by the way, is not a ceiling, it's a floor. That's the threshold that we think that you need to start causing real change. And the people are signed up for this. Of course, we believe in parity. The last thing I'd say is we extended beyond women into ethnicity in Britain this year, a reflection on Black Lives Matter, although we decided to do that extension before the terrible killing of George Floyd. And actually what that did for us was be very relevant to the things that businesses are facing today. So we said we want at least one person of colour on every FTSE 350 board. And because we're the 30% club and have a gender lens on everything, we said we wanted 50% of these seats to go to women of colour. Very clear goals, very easy to understand. Everybody loved it, all of the CEOs and chairs in the UK. And I'm expecting that kind of goal setting to extend around the world.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, and Anita and Sandrine. I think that really helps us set the stage. We do have an audience question that I'm going to pose, I think primarily really, Anne, I'm going to pose it to you, but I welcome others to, other Anita and Sandrine to weigh in. The 30% Club really focuses its efforts on voluntary compliance, right, on aspirational goals, and not on necessarily on setting quotas. So can you really talk a little bit about why you've taken that approach? You know, because we see in politics, the countries that do have more women, its quotas have been helpful in that regard. But I'm curious, how do you see quotas, and can it be, is that something you've considered? Do you think, the questioner says, do quotas make it harder for women to be taken seriously? I'd just love to get your thoughts about the quota versus aspirational goals.
Well, you know, I'm sure that people listening in today would hate to think that they got their job or their board appointment because they were part of a quota. Everyone wants to achieve based on, you know, their qualifications, their suitability for the role, etc. We wanted to go with aspirational goals because we felt that that actually caused a culture change. You can cause a culture change through quotas, but basically you're telling people what to do rather than asking them to buy into the idea that it's a good thing to do. I'm not totally adverse to quotas myself if we're in a situation that aspirational targets don't work and, you know, you've tried everything, then maybe quotas the only way. I mean, in France, for example, there are quotas for boards, and I think that France have good board participation for women, which is something like 36% right now. But the thing is, have they really changed inside the companies? I don't think so, because actually the 30% Club has just opened up an investor group in Paris of some of the biggest investors, including people like AXA, who are now talking to companies about how to diversify across the board. So I think that it's much, much stronger and it's got longevity if you allow CEOs and chairs to own the problem and to set the targets.
Can I chime in?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm probably more on the side that we need quotas. I mean, I think if aspirational targets can work, fabulous, but in many cases, voluntary anything has never fully worked. And I'm actually not sure that the point around higher management is actually linked to the aspirational target. I mean, I think that we see under the board level, a real issue across all higher management in all countries, because we haven't really been very clear in terms of policies. Now, I totally take the point around, however, that no woman wants to be taken just because she's a number. Neither does any migrant worker or any different colored person. I think that what we need is diversity overall, and what we've seen in Europe is that actually the quota system has enabled a shift, in particular in governments. So I think it is important. And I would also add that in the South, with very different cultural perspectives, we do need to think about setting some level of quotas in order to enable women to also be able to pursue their careers and also within governments more positions. So a quota system has been demonstrated as much more powerful in Southern countries as well.
Great. I want to move then to another kind of aspect of our conversation. You all have talked about the need for women at the table in every kind of decision making, whether that's in government, COVID recovery response, whether that's in the international arena or the corporate arena. So very important to have women at the table. Very important to have women in every place where decisions are being made and developing these policies. So we need a good policy framework, women at the table. I want to talk a little bit about gender norm change and increasing kind of the way we think about moving from promoting women's leadership, which is obviously critical, to thinking about gender equality and to thinking about how we engage men and how we change some of those gender norms. So I think that's a really sort of next step in this conversation. So Sandrine, I'll start with you because you're on my screen. But how do we think about that? What have you seen that can work to really move us towards a discussion of gender equality, changing gender norms, so that we get at these issues that came up in the survey? And certainly we all know from our lives as women who live our lives, we're under tremendous pressure. We have multiple responsibilities. How do we do all those things and also try to build a world that gives our daughters and sons equal opportunity?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I would say that part of that is what we all discussed, which is giving paternity leave as well as maternity leave, ensuring that we actually really develop a different way of looking at the way in which we live our lives for women and for men, which is much more equal. Again, no matter which creed, no matter which color, just the fact that the complexity also of the world that we live in, we need to talk more about well-being economics, we need to think about moving beyond growth, and we need to think also of how we develop and enhance those essential roles in our society. And I think, again, one of the key outcomes from COVID has been the role of men and women as caregivers, which is the parallel economy, which many of us don't actually even talk about. And we see that there are many men who are also caregivers as well as women. The role of men and women in the nursing profession. And can we not think about value-based professions rather than whether they are more female or more male-oriented? So I think some of these discussions are coming up. One of the ways in which we're talking about this is how we look at gender-proofing growth. So again, that parallel economy, enabling that parallel economy to come forward so that we look at more essential parts of the economy for men and for women. And I think it's been a really interesting conversation and something we launched at WECAN, the Women Enablers Change Agent Network. We're working also with men and also working with the European Commission. But we didn't say we necessarily only wanted women. We wanted more gender-based decision-making across the board, because gender-based decision-making means we're thinking about such an important part of our economy, which may be female-based. So looking at finance for women, funding, but also for small and medium-sized enterprises that might enable women and men.
Great. Anita, your thoughts on that?
I think that it is a combination of things. I agree totally with the looking at how policies, at how company policies or government policies actually affect the different genders in reality, because something that is neutral is not always neutral, right? Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, it almost always is not neutral, as we know. So this is something President Obama had actually, when he was president, had set up under the White House Council on Women and Girls. I think that actually required every piece of potential policy to be reviewed in terms of how it affected the different genders, so that it actually went through that kind of framing and that kind of review process, which obviously we have not had over the past 4 years. But I think that it's also increasingly, I do think that this is also a women at the table kind of issue as well. I think it very strongly about that, because I think that women have a great understanding, not just of the challenges these issues portray for them, and therefore can have a better understanding of the challenges these issues can portray for men who don't tend to think as much about them because they don't personally affect them as much. I think that the impact of policies, whether it's company policies or governmental policies, and how they have an impact though on the different genders, is the place to begin this discussion, because there's almost nothing that is neutral about it. I can say at my own firm, for instance, for years we were a company that had what was, I think, traditionally and reflected the fact that we had never actually thought about these issues very much, that we only had 2 weeks of paternity leave for men, and we had, 3 months of maternity leave for women, right? Until finally some of the women came to us and said, this just isn't fair and it's not right, because our husbands get better paternity leave than what we're doing at this firm. And it was actually eye-opening, but it was very real. So I think it is a conversation both for women and men to have, but I also think that the assumption that there's anything neutral about any kind of policy has to be revisited and tested, and that people have to challenge themselves continually on this. So.
Right, totally agree on that. Nothing is neutral. There's always some overlay. Yeah. Anne, your thoughts on this question? And I'm going to just also say we have 10 minutes left, so we're going to, after this question, I'm going to move into the final questions to the panelists. But Anne, go ahead.
Thank you, Stephanie. Completely agree with Anita, nothing's neutral. Completely agree that things have to be set according to policy. One of the things that concerns me is a study done at King's College London recently came out and said of 150,000 articles produced on COVID, analysed by AI, women's voices, 5% in STEM, 15% in economics, and 17% in politics. Now, this is absolutely appalling because it means that our thinking will not translate into policy because our voices are just not heard. And so I think that nothing is neutral. I think that we do have to call out when we see gender bias. And I think that we need to also set role models that that actually show that, you know, a job is not specific to a certain gender. I mean, I often tweet, you know, hashtag I am an engineer. You know, I'm a woman, but, you know, I'm an engineer. And the thing is, you know, why not? Google was caught changing sentences like, you know, she is a doctor, changing the sentence to he is a doctor because of the way that they did the algorithms. He is a caregiver, changed to she is a caregiver. We have to be really careful about AI and the future actually determining these gender roles even worse than they were in our day. And so I think naming it when you see gender bias, setting role models, and also encouraging girls into fields like STEM. At Mastercard, we've actually reached 1 million girls around the world now in 30 countries and brought them into our company and said, hey, it's great being in a tech company. Keep up with your STEM subjects because there's so many jobs you can do. And we're now expanding that to 5 million girls. I think we do have to start at the education level and we have to set expectations that men and women can do exactly the same roles. And actually, we need more girls in science. We need more in politics. We need more in economics because we just need women to take their place in the world's economy. And it's up to us as leaders to actually insist on this point and take very positive action towards it.
Well, I think, you know, it's a great segue to our last really kind of lightning round of questions, but because I do think you all point to, we did get a question from the audience that you actually, I think, answered in a lot of ways that, you know, are women opting out because the barriers are there, you know, and how do we get around that? So I think we're really trying to all grapple with that conversation. I just want to say this morning, I read an article that an insurance company, when they changed 6 words in the way they described jobs and in the application process, they got an astronomical number of more women applying because, you know, they said the jobs were either part-time or full-time, and they gave people who were applying the sense of they really being open to a lot of different, you know, skill sets coming in and applying for the jobs. Right, so super important. It's a small thing, but really, really makes a difference. So I'm going to ask each of you, I'll start with you, Anne, because you're on my screen, and then Anita and Sandrine, really in one word, or I'll give you 2, or a sentence. What have you learned from the pandemic in this arena in terms of addressing gender equality and women's leadership?
Well, I think I learned that we're all connected. We need to have a range of different skills to solve the problems that we're facing. And that coming out of this pandemic, women will play a key role in helping to solve climate change, which will be the next big crisis, if it's not already.
Okay, great. Anita.
How amorphous the gains that it appeared we had made in the United States really were in the face of the pandemic, and the challenge as we move forward and think about building it back is how do we make sure that the role of women is not as fraught with challenges the next time something like this happens? How do we make sure we don't lose ground next time?
Great. And Sandrine?
I think you're on mute, Sandrine.
Yes, Sandrine?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. We've seen this duality, right? We've seen the continuous vulnerability of women, the increase in abuse, the fact that women have been the ones that in many cases have lost their jobs and have been the most vulnerable, and clearly often are the most vulnerable in crises, including climate change, as Anne has also indicated. But we've also seen the incredible leadership of women. And so this duality is really important because it shows that we have to continue to hold governments and companies accountable for this vulnerability. And yet we need to also demonstrate that women are showing they can step up to the plate. And I think that in their leadership roles, they're really doing an amazing job. And this is a new model of leadership, which we really need to show and we should be proud of.
Great. I really want to thank the three of you. I know we're not quite done yet, but I will officially thank you at the end of the next 5 minutes. I want to turn it over now to Chiara Corazza, who everyone here knows or should know. She's the managing director of the Women's Forum. And Chiara, I know you're going to be speaking many times throughout the few days, but really, can you help us understand how you're going to take what's being discussed and really move on it in terms of action and advocacy?
First, let me thank you, Anita, Sandrine, and Anne, for your very inspiring debate. It was really very interesting. And thank you, Stephanie, for being also with all the time with us and moderating in such a wonderful way. My concern is what will be life after the coronavirus. Do we want to go back or do we want to move forward? And this barometer, it's gives us really precious tool to measure, compare reality and perception, to measure the progresses, to alert, and of course, to call to action. This is what we want, the consciousness of urgency. This gives us tools to alert and say, oh, we have to go. And yes, Stephanie, we did a lot in this year. We worked a lot on the ground, and we just sent to the, in the behalf of the Women's Forum, to the G7 leaders, a call to action for an inclusive recovery. Because what we want is a she-covery. Be sure that women are fully associated not only to benefit of the recovery, but that they're fully associated to define the criteria, the priority, to be sure that we are those who decide where we want to go. And this is a change, a real change. Why we're writing to the G7 leaders? Because, as you know, at the Women's Forum, we are deeply convinced that only strong joint action from key political leaders and key economic decision makers will succeed to build the inclusive world that we badly need, especially after the crisis. The G7 countries, as you know, hold more than 62% of the world net wealth. Their responsibility is huge. They have to lead by example, to be pioneers, because the risk is to go back to the Middle Age, as we heard. The stereotypes are strong. The stereotypes are persistent, even in new generation. Girls and boys from 18 to 24 years old. There are those who also answer to the question of the polls. And even women convey stereotype messages such as, it's impossible to combine family life and career, 53%. But let me focus on good news, and let me focus on what we are going to say and to do, our ambitions. According to the barometer, most of the people fully recognize the importance of gender disparity. That's the good news. They are aware. And even better, they are really convinced that reduced gender gap, especially now, it's a priority on crucial issues. I would just highlight two. STEM and business, you talked about, because we are sure that to reduce inequalities, we have to ensure that equal access to capital and to the skills needed to the jobs of the futures. The jobs will give us the opportunity to be there where we can transform the world. The jobs who are the drivers of the recovery, where women can and should fully contribute to the transformation of the world. And I have to share with you that I am particularly satisfied of one result, especially. 78% population of the G7 countries is convinced that a better access to STEM means economic growth, means a more ethical AI, and you underlined the danger of AI, and a positive impact on the society. 78% of the population is conscious of that. And that encourage us, that encourages in our demand and demonstrate the pertinence of our recommendation to the G7 countries and beyond. We want to attract, retain girls and women in STEM for primary school and boardrooms. And we give a lot of recommendation explaining how. We ask to launch lifelong campaign of skills, reskills, cross skills. We ask to allocate a dedicated, because you know, money is money. We ask to allocate a dedicated credit tax and to award companies, including with financial incentives, companies that ensure diversity in EI, because EI can be dangerous, as you just pointed out. Concerning access to capital, the very good surprise is that 84% of the population is convinced of the necessity to give equal access to public and private capital. That's good news. They are aware of that. And that perfectly corresponds of what we are asking to the head of state and government. We ask to promote women-owned businesses, including the supply chain. Public procurement should be used as a leverage to support women entrepreneurs, and women have to be involved in designing public procurement. Maybe with women perspective, we would bring more financial resources to education, health services, and health. I just would like to make it short because I see Sophie that asked me to conclude. But to conclude, I just will not give you examples in each crucial sector where women are most impacted and where the impact is paramount. The 5 issues that we focus in the Women's Forum Daring Circles: climate, business, work of the future, AI, and health. I just would like to underline hearing you that one of the key issues is to create an international women and climate fund to drive investments in performing sustainable projects empowering women. Climate and women are linked. We cannot fight against climate without women leadership. We ask to guarantee a work-life balance because, as you just said, otherwise career will be impossible. And we ask mandatory paid paternity leave, not only parental maternity, paternity leave. And we ask full gender balance in the governance of public and private companies, of course. And just to conclude, in this coronavirus crisis, we saw more than ever that we have to design a new health system and better take into account specific female diseases that sometimes are even not diagnostic, and we even don't know how to care of, including, of course, mental health.
Great.
Chiara, we are going to have to conclude, unfortunately, because we have another panel.
I will conclude. 99% of the respondents believe that gender equality should be a priority. That shows that the population is ready and more than ready for deep changes to overcome stereotypes and to progress for reaching gender equality. What are we waiting? Political leaders, business, I'm just calling to all of you, civil society, you all, and we in the Women's Forum. We have urgently to act. The recovery plan, it's the opportunity to put the woman at the heart of economy, science, and society. We need hope. We need clear objectives and vision. We have a momentum. We have to take and seize the chance. And I'm very confident when I see all the wonderful committed women and men that today and the next 2 days during this unprecedented Women's Forum will share inspiring stories, best practices, dare to lead, launch initiatives and stimulate action. Thank you all, and please enjoy this wonderful Women's Forum, your Women's Forum. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers for that crucial exchange. For my part, equality is not just a numbers game. COVID-19 has had a negative impact, but as our speakers mentioned, it has also demonstrated the leadership ability of women. Equality is really about women having the tools and using their skills for positive impact. It means creating policy frameworks from government and companies to give them those tools. Now, after this panel, we have a much clearer picture of how that can happen. So thank you once again, Stephanie, for moderating the first of many exciting discussions. And thank you also, Chiara, for your concluding comment and tremendous work in informing policy at the levels of the G7 and G20. Now that we have examined the state of play, the question remains, How do we sustain progress in a divided world? I will hand you over to our next moderator, Francesca Dunn, Gender Director of the New York Times and editor of the In Her Words newsletter. This is the first of 3 fireside chats during the global meeting, jointly curated by Women's Forum and the New York Times. To join this session, click on the purple timeline at the top of your screen. The session is titled Inclusion at a Crossroads, Sustaining Progress in a Divided World. You can also join this session via the live page or the program tab. Francesca, over to you.